The 1970s was a time of political turmoil and change, but the decade also gave way to some far-out fashions that made it pretty cool to experience. People from all walks of life helped to shape the fashion of the 70s. Whether you lived in the decade yourself or you're just a fan of the era's fashion, then sit tight. In this video, we will take a look back at some of the most popular fashions in the 1970s. During the 70s, many women ditched their bras and instead opted for the tube top. This strapless style saw a surge in popularity by the end of the decade. This fashion was frequently worn by famous women like Cher, Bianca Jagger, and Suzanne Summers. Hot pants or extremely short shorts was a term first coined by Women's Wear Daily in 1970 to describe itty-bitty shorts. Usually, these were made in luxury fabrics like velvet and satin. In the early part of the decade, designers offered high-end versions of this fashion staple, while stores like Sears offered cheaper alternatives. Celebrities such as Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, Elizabeth Taylor, Nancy Sinatra, and yes, even David Bowie sported these. The 70s was all about flair, and small collars were out while large oversized collars were in. They were worn by everyone from Elvis to Mick Jagger, and they kept the button-up shirts from looking, well, buttoned up. Platform shoes had a little time to shine in the 1930s, but their appearance in the 1970s edition of 17 magazine brought them into mainstream popularity. They were often worn with bell-bottoms and covered in glitter or other colorful assortments. These shoes were typically worn by women in their teens and 20s, but there were also men who were known to wear these to the discotheque. A number of celebrities adorned these shoes throughout the decade. Corduroy material had been around for decades, but the 1970s saw the material become super fashionable. Bell-bottoms and even full suits were made out of it. If you were a stylish dresser in the 70s, then you definitely had a corduroy in your wardrobe. One of the decade's most iconic outfits was John Travolta's white suit that he wore in 1977's Saturday Night Fever. This movie caused the popularity of the leisure suit to hit its apex. Leisure suits frequently consisted of a fitted jacket, bell-bottom pants, and a button-up shirt, which the top few buttons were left undone. Wrap dresses were a staple among 70s trendsetters. They were more of a form-fitting alternative to kaftans and loose maxi dresses. Designer Diane von Furstenberg is the one who is credited with bringing this knit jersey wrap dress to the market in 1974. By the end of the decade, she had created a fashion empire worth more than $100 million. When it came to 1970s jewelry, you could never go wrong with big, bold, and gold. The decade saw a major resurgence with yellow gold jewelry, and particularly with thick yellow gold chains. This trend also carried over into the 1980s and became noticeable with the hip-hop style. Perhaps there is no bigger iconic style of the 1970s than bell-bottoms. In the earlier part of the decade, husband and wife entertainers Sonny and Cher helped this style to gain an international following after they repeatedly wore them on their television show. These flared pants could be made in denim, bright cotton, and satin polyester. It was certainly one of the decade's must-have fashions. Micro miniskirts first became popularized in the 1960s. However, they became even more popular in the 70s thanks to feminists like Gloria Steinem identifying the trend as a form of liberation from longer hemlines of the decades past. The mood ring hit the market in 1975 and it became super popular. These rings would change color in response to the wearer's body heat, which was supposedly a way of telling their mood. Some of the high-end versions sold for as much as $250. Since you probably no longer have one of these, then I'm sure you have no idea how you feel about it. Sheepskin coats were also known as shearlings. These were just as popular in the 70s as members-only jackets were in the 1980s. They may only be considered a luxury item by today's standards, but they were available in every department store in the 1970s. Sheepskin coats were defined by their buttery exterior and fleece interior. Halter tops were another hugely popular fashion item of the 1970s. They would tie around the neck rather than being held up by shoulder straps. Some of the big designers of the decade even incorporated them into their evening wear lines. Everyone who was someone seemed to be wearing these. Black leather jackets became a staple among punks in the 1970s, and they've remained an emblem of the counterculture ever since. Just a couple decades earlier in the 1950s, they had been a hallmark of the greaser style. However, 70s punks customized their jackets with studs, patches, and pins. As punk rock music grew in popularity during the 1970s, so too did the styles that were associated with this music genre. Some were wearing brightly colored mohawks, makeup, and even drainpipe jeans. For those that were wanting to ease into the style, studded belts became a way to emulate some of this subculture without a full Johnny Rotten look. Wearing just the belt was a lot more socially acceptable. Creepers were a comfortable alternative to traditional platforms. They were still thick-soled and became very popular among punks and hippies during the decade. In more recent times, Rihanna has included creepers in her collaboration of shoe lines. Headscarves were popular among hippies in the 1960s, but they were also popular among stylish individuals in the 1970s. These scarves were often made of polyester or silk and dyed in bright colors. They were usually worn as headbands or tied in a turban style. Jumpsuits were also something to have for anyone that was into fashion during the 1970s. They came in an assortment of materials from polyester to fishnet and silk to macrame. Jumpsuits were worn by celebrities like Cher, Farrah Fawcett, and Jerry Hall. This one-piece garment was associated with the disco style and could be seen in clubs like Studio 54. Go-go boots first appeared in 1964, and the term has come to include any boots that are knee-high, square-toed, and block-heeled. In the 70s, the world's most famous models and actresses were spotted wearing a pair of these, from fashion icon Twiggy to the controversial bombshell Brigitte Bardot. Before the 1970s, caftans had a reputation of being frumpy house dresses or beach cover-ups. However, during the 70s decade, they came into mainstream. These figure-obscuring frocks became so popular that luxury brands began to start carrying them. Maxi dresses were similar to caftans in that they were long and frequently oversized. However, they typically had a more defined shape with plunging necklines, tie waists, and fitted sleeves, which gave them a more streamlined look. Wooden-sided shoes have been worn throughout Europe and Asia for centuries, although it wasn't until the 1970s that clogs became part of mainstream fashion. These shoes were typically made with wooden soles, leather upper material, and visible metal studs that joined the two parts together. Clogs that had chunky heels became one of the go-to footwear styles of the 70s. Colorful tie-dye shirts gained traction during the hippie movement of the 1960s. But this psychedelic pattern saw its popularity rise during the 1970s. Anyone had the ability to create this look using little more than rubber bands and dye. Black leather jackets may have been worn by punks in the 70s, but everyone else who was into fashion was wearing brown leather with fringe. These jackets also accompanied the rise in popularity of Western wear at the time, with bolo ties and embroidered button-ups also becoming major trends. Aviator-style glasses were first used by pilots in the 1930s to help keep their eyes safe from irritants during flight. They were first created by Bosch and Lohm in 1936, but in the 1970s they saw a surge in popularity. Fashion icons of the time, including Elvis Presley, brought this trend into the mainstream, but it was Bosch and Lohm's Ray-Ban brand that flooded the market. Many of these items that we discussed were essential outfits and accessories of the decade. There is no doubt that every cool person in the 70s had at least some of these in their closet. I hope you enjoyed this little fashion flashback of the 1970s. Thanks for watching.